The onSecurity podcast aims to inform and challenge the viewer on all things cybersecurity. Our sponsor, Onshore Security, is a premier provider of full telemetry cybersecurity detection via its Panoptic Cyber Defense Service and managed security solutions.
Welcome again, everybody, to the Onshore onSecurity podcast. I'm Stel Valavanis. I'm the CEO of Onshore Security. Today, we have James Moore, who is the Director of Online Learning at the School of Business at DePaul University. James, say hello.
Hello.
And Josh Ecklow, our producer. Say hi, Josh. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks for making it happen all the time. And James, thanks for being here. I'm actually, intrigued and not just like hyped up. The world wants to hear about AI everything, but hey, come on, people can throw out their use cases left and right, whatnot. But let's talk to somebody here who's not only having to get the education out there, but also has to deal with it. So, James, you said you had some real novel, well, let's say seriously challenging use cases too of AI in cyber attacks. You want to start us off with that?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I work and teach at DePaul University here in Chicago, and I work in a college of business. So that puts us at an interesting sort of tip of the spear. So with business, our approach at the moment is AI is a transformative technology that can improve how businesses are more productive. So it's something that we're teaching our students to use ethically and appropriately. But it's also a challenge to us as an academic unit because with the plethora of large language models, it's now trivial for a student to use those to create articulate responses to questions posed by their professors. And these can be questions that deal with current terms and terminology, deal with code like Python, or formula that might be in an Excel spreadsheet. So it's interesting sort of working out if the student is appropriately responding to a question or if they're using some artificial intelligence to respond to that question.
No, I like the idea of plagiarism as a cyber attack. We'll have to try that one. But we'll dovetail all these things. Okay,
Yeah,
tell us about the attacks. Tell us about some of the attacks you're familiar with in your world and what you studied.
sure. So I was using the example of a large language model in terms of creating plagiarized content
Mhm.
in an academic setting. But that sort of use case can happen quite easily outside of that setting. So the thing to me that's interesting is with the growth of large language models and as they get more sophisticated, it's trivial to create a locally learned sort of instance in which a large language model can impersonate a person and can be used to sort of fish quite eloquently and elegantly by knowing how someone is likely to respond. So I have started to see this at a personal level. So I'm seeing messages that come into me, sort of requests to join on LinkedIn, information from sort of Reddit posts that I can see have been trained and are used as a way to sort of get past my initial defenses.
Are the vectors any different? I mean, the vectors you mentioned now are pretty consistently used for phishing already, and you probably can tell. And sometimes is it a bot or not? Whatnot. Anything different about these vectors? Anything different about the better
Not
large language models that
particularly.
make these vectors
No,
more?
I'd say the vector's the same because they're typically sort of approaching you on social media, email, or text because those are the common ways that we communicate. The issue there is basically a change in economics. And I sort of see it as being similar to the growth of spam email in the 1990s. So if you think back to that decade, there was a growth in CDs that you could purchase that contained a list of email addresses and then the software to send out bulk email. So this was a change in the economics. It became vastly affordable for someone to send out spam email for Viagra and other
Yeah,
services.
yeah. And now,
Similar thing today with the large language models, it
yeah.
becomes increasingly trivial to create targeted emails at scale. So you just put in a data set of email addresses, background, information about the person, and you can send something out. The sort of only other sort of change I see to vector
Yeah.
there is probably voice calls.
Ah,
So the thing again that's interesting to me here is you can train a model on someone's voice. And with that, you can create voicemail messages or even live calls that impersonate a person. So this is interesting in this context. We're creating a podcast here. So if you think about all of the onshore podcasts that you've created, there's enough training data there for someone to simulate an effective clone of your voice. Leave a voicemail with one of your colleagues saying, "Hey, this is Stel. I've lost my phone. I need to buy a new one. Can you transfer some funds to this account here on Venmo?"
Right. It's like all of these different um, methods, let's say, and the vectors, the kind of the like core component that is exposed is cheapness. Can
Mhm,
you do something? You if you're going to trick people as a human, you could probably do a great job, but can you do it cheap enough? Like send
mhm,
lots of emails, send a lot of generate the content for a lot of emails. Now mimic a voice, consistently spread that out, copy it. Frankly, I'd say this data is enough to deep fake my video too. I don't think we're very far from that being kind of cheap enough. The tech's already there. Is it cheap enough to do it on a wide scale so that cybercrime pays? So yeah, I'm not sure totally it's the same problem in every case, but so far in all the examples that you brought up, that seems to be kind of the problem the cyber criminal is solving. It's just
mhm.
how do I do this cheap enough so that the bit that I harvest is worth my effort. Um, now, you also mentioned something like, with the kind of the plagiarism side of AI. You mentioned coding. I'm intrigued by that.
Mhm.
How do you think that plays? We'll get to the content and plagiarism side of it in academics and other spaces. But what about as for cyber attacks? Or is there anything interesting going on, or that you anticipate from the research of your institution on coding and
Yeah.
AI using coding to now improve cyber attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a
Mhm.
couple of sort of levels to address that question. So the first one is the increased use of Copilot. So Copilot is basically a large language model service that uses the data within GitHub to allow programmers to become more efficient. So it's a great service. You're a coder, you're looking to do something, you don't quite know how to do it. So rather than going to Stack Overflow or some other service, you're using Copilot and basically putting in a natural language question to say, how do I do this in code?
Mhm.
The issue
Or
there
make
is
the
sometimes,
code. Give me the code that does this.
yeah,
Right? Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So the issue there is without sort of appropriate safeguards, the code that is created there by the large language model uh, could be for nefarious purposes. So with Copilot, there are a degree of sort of safeguards there where they're looking to sort of prevent too much nefarious coding taking place on their platform. But the other issue there is the code that's created, because it's going through a large language model, injects a degree of variance there. So if you put the same request in multiple times, you'll get slightly random results. So
Mm.
that means that occasionally the code that you're getting may not be quite as secure as it could be. And sometimes it's difficult to put an appropriate prompt to create code that is secure as it can be. So this creates an opportunity where people might be creating code for institutions and organizations that isn't as secure as it can be because the programmer was in a hurry to create something and use these services to basically improve their productivity.
Right. And maybe
So
you.
that's issue one.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Go on.
But then issue two is getting sort of back to your economic incentives, the fact that the cost of creating something is lower. So with these tools now, someone who wants to sort of create malicious code but doesn't have the skills has services that allows them to create code more easily and more rapidly. So that is something to think about.
Yeah. I mean,
And then there's sort of a sideline to that.
yeah.
This is something that has been published recently, but there's a thing called indirect prompt injection attacks.
Okay.
So this is a way that if someone is using a chatbot that has a live service that's partly autonomous, something that can visit websites,
Mhm.
if it visits a website, you can inject a prompt that is read by the chatbot. So the way that you do this is you would have code on the page that says, "Okay, I would like you to do this." And this is analogous to the DANs, the do anything networks that people are using as ways to subvert chatbots at the moment. But anyway, you put in that prompt in 0 point fonts on a website. Someone's visiting with something equivalent to Bing. That injection is put into the chatbot, and now the chatbot will try and mine data from the user who's using that service. So this is particularly interesting because I'm sure you're seeing at the moment is there's sort of a race to use AI services because this is such a sort of a transformative technology that empowers people to be more productive. We start to use these services with perhaps less diligence. And I'm sure the concern that you have as a security professional is quite often problems happen because people who don't understand the risks get access to services that they shouldn't have.
Yeah. Well, and controlling privileges, of course, always, and content always is a challenge. I actually don't like the brute force method of content filtering employed
Mhm.
heavily these days, but I mean, it's kind of what we have. Yeah, and there's tons of these, whatever, I don't want to, just diss on WordPress, but
Mhm.
WordPress is hacked a lot. People don't have plugins up to date. There's a lot of
And it's
zero.
50% of the internet. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and so those are the easy targets for people to inject malware. Now these can be made secure. There's I think there's less secure stuff than WordPress. It's just ubiquitous, and so it
Yeah.
gets attacked. Yeah. Similar to I guess maybe Microsoft. I don't know. That's a different argument. But sure, yeah. And so now, yeah, people leave code all over, and we've seen people do that already with some kind of malware that's downloadable, whatnot, using these kind of sites. They use them for command and control. So that's not going to end. I mean, we could certainly do better there. It's definitely something to us to cover as cybersecurity an industry, and in good practices, et cetera. Kind of the same old. I make that point a lot. Like when people say, "What's new? What do we do?" I say, like, how about we do that same old stuff we've been talking about for 20 years, and that we kind of finally get around to it. It's shocking how much is still left open there. But now with a vector that's known, understood, we know what to do about that vector. Let's get these sites secure. The danger is higher. In other words, so like the impact is greater because you have a bot doing the work. When you
Mhm.
give it commands, that bot now can get into your environment before, oh, you have to click something, you have to run executable. I can look for those things. How the hell are we going to find that chat bot that you're having to do searches for just got a command that you didn't intend to give it because it went to the site? I mean, we could look on the network for that kind of activity. I mean, maybe we have to mine the chatbot sessions and then, of course, expose privacy concerns too. Um,
Yeah.
wow, this is
So from my perspective,
yeah,
I would probably get back to sort of blocking certain ports and certain URLs. So if we think about
yeah,
GPT as an example,
yeah.
I think there's a couple of sort of concerns to the organization. So the first one is if you're using the Chat GPT free or Chat GPT plus service via the web, your information there is being used as training data by ChatGPT.
Mhm,
So if you get back to the example of someone using that as a way to improve their code, the code that you're using within the organization is now known by ChatGPT.
mhm.
So there have been some scenarios in the past where that code has basically surfaced somewhere else. So that's a pretty substantial security risk. If you move towards using the API, then the difference is that your data is basically contained within ChatGPT services for 30 days and then deleted unless you've demonstrated that you've done something, illegal. So again, that creates an opportunity to block that port to prevent people from using those services. So that's something that I would suggest to most organizations. Also, along with getting people within the organization to tell you if they're using large language models in the creation of content, because I think that does create a couple of sort of security risks. First, if we think about content, there's the tendency for these services to hallucinate. So there may be content that's incorrect within the network. Um, the second one is that basically, these services are learning from the content that's created.
Yeah, James. Yeah, I really, appreciate that. There's some nuance to all these different tools and whatnot, and what they've done in order to kind of, let's say, give us some control. You mentioned that there is, for instance, using in case of GPT. I mean, we talk a lot about ChatGPT. We know it's not the only thing out there. In fact, Copilot has pre-existed ChatGPT by a good bit. So, but now you made a point. Um, we have IP and privacy, et cetera, business secrets, whatever kind of concerns when we're talking about using ChatGPT that could get injected, with hidden content on compromised sites. I mean, we could do all kinds of brute force things to kind of manage that. But you mentioned something interesting. If you use the API, there's some greater kind of guarantee there of security, privacy, et cetera, and that is via the form of they drop that data. They don't train on that data, right? Right. Either they
Yeah.
drop it, and so how good is that? Tell us what the value of that is, and then what else can we do then? Let's say we're using the API and it helps us a bit.
Sure. So OpenAI definitely wants to be the engine that drives generative AI for many businesses. So if you're using their API, they give you some protections there. So recently, they have announced that they won't use the data there to train their systems. So that's a good thing.
Okay, right, right.
Obviously, there's sort of the issue of trust there. How well do you trust their promise? But basically, they're not going to use that data to train the services. And that data will be deleted after 30 days, providing you didn't do anything illegal or broke their terms and conditions. So that's a good
Okay.
thing. The issue there is you're not going to have access to GPT-4 at the moment. So this is access to GPT 3.5 for most people. And that also creates some limitations. So there's a limit to the token size. So basically, any conversation that you're having with the service there is limited to about 3,000 words. I think it's just over 4,000 tokens. So
Hmm.
there are services out there that have a larger context limit. So an example of that would be Claude, which is Anthropic's large language model.
Hmm.
I forget the exact number there, but it's a sort of equivalent to book size context window. So for some, businesses, that's the service that's going to provide a more useful product. And there, my knowledge isn't quite as well developed. So I'm using Claude through Poe, which is a third-party service.
Hmm.
And there, obviously, you're using a website, and because it's a third party, perhaps there aren't as many sort of security protections. But I'm just doing
Hmm.
that for kicks at the moment to sort of
Sure, sure.
discover what that service can do.
Yeah, I mean this stuff's so early. We don't have to keep reminding ourselves like, well, maybe this limitations. Well, yeah, we're going to see all kinds of iterations. Um, okay, but now, what about that organization? Organization's concerned. They can block all the ports access to the different AI tools out there. People can use their personal devices still. I mean, it's just this is like almost like a cat and mouse game if you go that route.
Mhm.
But anything else that's interesting that organizations could do to
Yeah,
kind of minimize the negative effects?
yeah. So I'm sure you've seen this for very large organizations. They're moving towards developing their own large language models. So Bloomberg is a good example of that. So they've
Okay.
recently announced that they have their own model. So they're doing that so that they can keep the data internally, that they can constrain the users of the system internally. But many of us don't have the resources that Bloomberg has. So the
Sure.
thing that I'm finding interesting at the moment is the growth of local large language models. So I don't know if you've used generative AI art systems in the past. So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Playing.
stable diffusion is probably
Sure.
what
Sure.
you've
Yeah.
used. And the advantage there is stable diffusion is something that you can run locally on your own hardware. So
Mhm.
this means that the prompts that you use, the images that you create, stay local to your device. So there's a high degree of privacy, but it's running on your local device. So here,
Right.
because it's open source software, we have the opportunity to check the code to make sure that it's not sending data externally, all
Mhm.
that good
Mhm.
stuff.
Mhm.
But the thing that's interesting to me is the growth of these large language models that run locally. So Meta, fairly recently, released Llama, their local large language model. And as I'm sure you saw in the media, this was uploaded to various peer to peer networking sites and people created their own local copies. But from that, we've had the development of similar large language models that utilize the llama sort of model. So Alpaca from Stanford is an example of that. So this is a
Mhm.
large language model that you can run on your own device. Not quite as powerful because obviously we typically don't have a large number of GPUs on our devices. We don't have an infinite uh, RAM. But this is where things start to get a little bit scary because there's the opportunity for people to train these models locally to do bad things. Or there's the opportunity to train these models locally to do good things. So for some smaller organizations, this might be an interesting way to develop something that is used as a customer service agent or as an audit tool for the network to check and see
Mhm.
that the traffic
Mhm.
coming in and out, is valid. So that's an interesting development. That's going to be something that is really going to grow over the next couple of years, I think.
Yeah, I always thought, and this isn't completely new because of the latest changes, but I always thought that the interface with computers, just needed to be better. I mean, I was,
Mhm.
early adopter of GUIs, for instance. I flipped from Apple II to Mac pretty readily and embraced that. And the way back when I was doing software development, always loved this kinds of easier to use tools. What is easier to use? Easier to move where people can do it. There's shortcuts to code. Deal with lists. So I can see that happening in applications. And it's really surprisingly to me, it's been bare, been not much. Um, but I think that's exposure too. Let's say you've got your whatever Adobe Suite or Excel or whatever application, and now it can be commanded, whether it's audio or it's typing, whatnot. It can be commanded and do a lot of things without you having to, learn something really well or etc. And so that's a locally run AI helps because now you don't worry about the privacy, IP, et cetera, whatnot, security of that. But then again, we also have people that get malware onto our boxes. If it's ubiquitous, okay, Stable Diffusion or something like that's not necessarily ubiquitous, but if Excel's ubiquitous, and if Excel has a local AI that gives you an interface to it to command it and tell it to make charts or whatever, that's yet another opening, just like I guess macros have been
Yeah.
for an attack or two. I mean, any thoughts about like how
Yeah.
whether local versus centralized, and also like any other kinds of controls like we have with
Yeah,
Mac?
and you're so right there. So Microsoft, as we've seen in the media, has invested a significant amount of money in OpenAI, and
Yeah.
they're looking to integrate those services in basically all of their products. So last month, Microsoft made their pitch to say that Copilot would be integrated into the core Office products. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of have all of them have the ability to use that. So the thing that's slightly scary to me is that Office creates a high level of convenience, and from a security perspective, convenience is your foe.
Mhm.
The easier it is
Mhm.
to do something, the more likely that some bad actor will get in or some
Mhm.
piece of code will be injected into your system. So I think that is a concern. We could go the route and sort of try and move away from Microsoft products for certain
Um,
businesses. So
that's
if you're
just
sort of
yeah. It could
finance,
be browsers. It could be anything. Yeah.
yeah. So it does concern me a little bit. I'll visit the 365 portal to access my email, and then when I use their Bing service for search, I can see that data from my emails is informing the service there. So that,
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
me,
Hmm.
again, is a little bit scary. That fact that that convenience is there is going to create some opportunity for bad things to happen. And again, if we circle back to this concept of sort of indirect prompt injection,
Hmm.
this might be the route that this happens. So perhaps something comes in as an email there that then impacts your use of Excel or Word later in the day. So,
Right, right. You're rendering some content. Wow, I mean, it's kind of we're back to same old now, James. What the hell? It's like then means okay, great. Let's now monitor behavior on all the devices. Is the outcome, is the final thing being done something that is concerning? Data is moving somewhere it doesn't normally move. Processes running don't normally run, etc. Same on the network. Uh, this service talking to this service. So it's like we're watching behavior. It used to be like human behavior. Then it was here's some kind of malicious behavior. Now it's bot behavior. It's like there's just I think there has to be a whole there's something has to we have to shatter that kind of
Yeah.
that ceiling
And there's a
somehow.
human desire to automate things. So if you think about people at
Yeah.
home, they're putting in home automation, sorry,
Yeah.
home
Yeah.
automation systems. So when you get home, the lights switch on, the lights dim, the shades open, the shades close, that type of thing. The more we automate there, again, the higher the potential for bad things to happen. And the
Yeah.
concern for me there typically is most sort of consumer devices are not updated frequently. So again, there's less
Right.
economic incentive for the manufacturer to provide safety protocols because the device has been sold and typically there's no sort of after sales process. If we move to a
Yeah.
subscription
Yeah.
process, then perhaps there's more opportunity for more secure devices at home. But yeah, automation is scary.
Yeah, you're right about the model. The subscription could lend itself to some kind of greater liability put onto the provider. Well, for one, they theoretically should be able to keep things more up to date. That's not easy necessarily. It's not just a matter of users not doing it. It's a matter of hardware getting deprecated too.
Mhm,
So that's a factor. Um, but you're also getting into the space of policy
mhm,
too. So what does the law say about what liability there is? A good example is forever the content on the internet was that user's content, not the platform's content
mhm,
as far as liability goes. And they could have keep their arm's length from it. So those kinds of things would have to change, and we're opening up a whole other can of worms. Oh my God, James, it's we're dead in the water. Okay, I feel for our whatever teenage children, what they're going to confront. But we do have to try to solve it for their sake, at least, if not the entire world economy and the safety of humanity and everything, because it's where it could go is bad. Now, I'm actually the not the naysayer. I'm throwing that out there to make a point. I'm the future thinking positive person that we're going to do kind of good things with it, but we do have to solve this exposure, and I fear that same old may still work like it has cat and mouse, but I fear that we really need a whole kind of new epiphany of protection. And then that's my job, not your job. Unfortunately, you got to keep doing your job and making my job harder. So, so I do want to touch on one more thing though before we wrap. Is on the academic side, you had mentioned to me in our prep that there's challenges, as an academic institution with plagiarism and maybe other things. I don't want to boil down to that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating space to be at the moment. So if you think about academia with the US, in the US, typically the way that we assess knowledge is through writing. So,
Hmm.
there'll be a question and a student will respond in an essay form, or perhaps they're creating code, but that's typically the way that we assess. And over the years, that assessment process has moved online for justifiable reasons. It doesn't make sense to sit in a room writing responses in a blue book to a question. So students have moved over to learning management systems. This is great. But now, more recently, there's the opportunity for a student to use these large language models to answer complex questions. And there's sort of an economic incentive at play here. So a lot of students are working or have family and life responsibilities that make juggling the study work life balance difficult. So over time, there's pressure to sort of use something to be a little bit more efficient. So we're seeing here at various universities that students are using these models to answer discussion questions, to respond to high stakes exams, and in the past, we've been able to detect that because the large language models weren't that sophisticated. When they
Hmm.
started to hallucinate, we would see that there were sort of verbal tics. But since the release of GPT 3.5 and now 4, these tools are fairly sophisticated and they're hard to detect. So at the moment, there are services that say that they will detect the use of AI
Hmm.
generated text, but there's a high degree of false positives. So if you think about detecting AI generated content, that process is difficult. And what it's doing is basically looking at the model of text to see if it has a statistical sort of signature that makes it feel like it's been generated by a bot rather than
Hmm.
a human. It has less burstiness, it has perhaps less variety, but increasingly students are using services to improve their language that may make it look as if it's been written by a bot. So Grammarly is an example of this. So Grammarly uses AI systems to improve the grammar. And a lot of our students, English is their second or third language, or even like me, I sometimes feel less comfortable writing something. I want to check that it's as good as
Yeah.
it can be before I submit it. So we're creating this interesting sort of dynamic in which students may be using these services for bad, or they may be using these services for good, and it increases the likelihood that their content is flagged as being generated by AI.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
Turnitin is an interesting example here. So for years, Turnitin has created plagiarism detection services for academics. So these are ways that you can demonstrate that text has been lifted from someplace on the internet and then repurposed. Now, repurposing content is sometimes valid. So if you provide a citation, if you're demonstrating that this is data that is incorporated into your argument, that's appropriate. When it's used without that citation, without that structure, then it's cheating. So Turnitin has provided this service that's worked fantastically. More recently, they've created a service that flags content to say that this is being generated by AI. And the issue here is this is not forensically valid.
Hmm.
It's data that's come up from a black box service to say, we think this is AI generated, but there's
Hmm.
no way that we can dig in deeper to demonstrate why that choice has been made. And this is going to put some academics in a difficult position where they feel that the content that they're looking at is plagiarized.
Hmm.
They've got a system that's telling them that it looks like it's plagiarized and perhaps to a high degree. And then how do they respond? Because this is like playing poker. You've got a
Hmm.
feeling that the other side is bluffing, but you've got no proof. And if the student has done nothing wrong and you've accused them of cheating, you have destroyed your relationship with that student and you've created an adverse situation that's difficult to get out of. So I
Hmm.
really feel for a lot of academics at the moment.
I think it's kind of like a um, what's the word I want to use? It's like a it's it's a pioneering kind of area where we have to not just look. It's relevant to cybersecurity because that kind of analysis of the data to determine to what degree of fakeness there is or what's being used. Those methods and tools are going to dovetail perfectly well with cybersecurity. But also, like cybersecurity, it's a matter of policy too. In the case of academics, what is it we care about? There was a time you couldn't use a calculator. You had to manually do all these computations. That was good for you. In sports, we don't allow for steroid use and whatnot. Why? Well, because it's a cheating. What if everybody could use steroids? Well, there's a harm to it, because so you could say the harm to the plagiarizing student is that you're not learning how to write, not just that it's not fair. So we need to rethink about what we care about too. We need to rethink about what intellectual property is. When we're training students, teaching them whatever, writing poetry, we have to think about what is it about it similar to like the calculator. Do we care that you can't calculate big numbers quickly? You could use a calculator instead. Do we care that a poet can interact with a bot to create awesome poetry? I don't know. I'm not weighing in either way, but I'm saying that is the forefront. That's the frontier is very well could be in your hands, James, in academics to challenge understanding what it means to train people, what tools are legitimate, intellectual property, plagiarism, detecting these things, mitigating against them, the relationships that occur from it, the danger. Yeah, it's sorry, my friend, but you're out there
But it's going
at
to be
the
fun.
front line.
It's going to be a lot of fun because really we just need to change
Yeah.
the nature of assessment. So again, I
Yeah.
can only sort of speak for my experience, my university and my college. But here, what we're trying to do is to empower students with the knowledge of how these systems work, direct them to ways that they can use them ethically to improve their studies, and demonstrate that there are some sort of failures within the models. So, as we mentioned earlier, these systems will hallucinate, they'll create fake data. So it's training future generations to realize that AI may be a great tool, but you need to verify the data that comes out of it.
Yeah, and I think we've done well with mathematics and kind of how calculators got integrated with that, but it wasn't overnight. I am glad you're there. I'm glad universities are there, and I would really like to see universities stay at that forefront and kind of protect against companies and threat actors being at that forefront because they have perverse incentives.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that, I like to wrap, and we'll probably have you on again because of this is an ever changing space, and there's a lot more to talk about too, on other topics. I mean, but James, it's really wonderful to have you. Thank you for giving us your time. And just jump back if there's something new that comes up you really want to make sure you get an audience for. Um, and thank you, Josh, for doing your great production job as usual.
Thank you, guys. Great conversation.
And our lovely audience. See you next time. Onshore On Security Podcast, signing out for today.